welcome to The Art of Adventure. This is episode 278 with New York Times bestselling author Alex Hutchinson. The Art of Adventure is the podcast where we look at unconventional lifestyles, peak performance, human potential, entrepreneurship, travel, cutting-edge science, all the stuff that I think is really cool. I'm your host, lead explorer, and guide, Derek Loudermilk. You can check out derekloudermilk.com for the show notes and more information about upcoming book projects, workshops, events, and other such things. So in today's episode, Alex Hutchinson, he's on the show to talk about the limits of endurance and human performance. So he's a national magazine award-winning journalist. He began his career as a physicist, got a Ph.D. from the University of Cambridge, and worked for the U.S. National Security Agency. He's a two-time finalist in the 1500 meters at the Canadian Olympic Trials. And when he was at the NSA, he was training and competing as a middle and long distance runner for the Canadian national team. So as a former collegiate runner myself, I really studied the limits of my own endurance and sports potential. And as a cyclist, now I'm constantly experimenting with stuff. And so I was reading this book, his book, Endure, The Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. And it caused me to want to reach out and do an interview with him. And because I was testing some of this stuff. But so all that is to say, he was a way better runner than I was. He was a really, really good runner. And he spent nearly a decade thinking about and researching this project. And this is the kind of stuff that he writes about. He's a regular contributor to Runner's World and Outside Magazine. He also writes for the New York Times, New Yorker, Toronto's Globe and Mail. And he also was one of the two journalists that was allowed to cover Nike's top secret project to break the 2-hour marathon, which, if you haven't seen that, was also really cool. So we're going to be talking about performance and running and sports a lot, but there's a lot in here, even if you're not an athlete, to understand the limits of what you can do. And it all comes down to things around, we're going to be talking about things like belief and technology and feedback loops and brain stimulation, zapping the brain, pain tolerance, because he defines endurance as the ability to keep doing something when you want to stop. And that applies to so much more, from parenting to entrepreneurship to just about anything, to a long plane ride. So this is a really great extended length episode. I think we went about 90 minutes, and we get into, me asking him questions about, wow, you just spent 10 years on this project. It's a New York Times bestseller. How are you thinking about what you're going to do next? Because a lot of people are asking him, what's your next project? So I think it's really cool that he was able to share some insights for how he's thinking about how his life and career are going to develop after, hitting this huge home run of a book. So I'm very excited to introduce you to Alex Hutchinson. Here he is. Alex Hutchinson, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Derek. It's great to be here.
I'm super excited because your book, I've been slowly reading it for the last couple of months, and the reason I've been reading it slowly is because I encounter some cool piece of information, and then I want to go and try something out. It's so full of information. The book is Endure, Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. That reminds me of the Altoids, the Curiously Strong.
I hadn't made that connection before. Probably subconsciously, that's where the title came from.
And I'm curious about where your curiosity for digging into this started.
Yeah, I guess the obvious answer is that I was a runner. I started running in high school and continued running through college and after. And if you're going out and testing your limits in races on a regular basis, it's hard not to start wondering about, when you wish you could have gone that fraction faster, or when you do have a breakthrough or whatever, to sort of wonder what exactly happened. Was it really just that, my heart got 2% stronger or whatever the case may be, or I grew some new capillaries, or are there other factors that were influencing what I perceived to be my limits? And so I think that, the simple answer is trying to understand my own racing performances, and of course, wishing that I was faster than I was has always made me very curious about what my limits actually were.
I think it's a universal sort of wishing for better genetics, or wishing for, if I could only train harder or have more willpower or something, like for these superhuman abilities, so we could go and crush our competition.
I'll jump in and say we're always wishing for, like, if only there was this one neat trick that I could do that would expand my limits by 10%, like an internet ad. And I should say, right at the top of this conversation, there's no one neat trick that's going to make you magically faster in my book or anywhere else. But there are a lot of little things that I think, I guess getting back to the curiously elastic, I think our limits are less defined than we think they are. But I don't want to overpromise and say I discovered the neat trick that will allow you to to win races and become rich and powerful and all that.
I think there's this idea, especially in sports, of progressing and getting more fit or more strength, or building muscle or endurance or all these things. And sometimes it's sort of a linear step-by-step thing, but sometimes you have these big breakthroughs all at once that can be surprising because they don't follow the same trajectory. And have you experienced that in your own?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, getting back to your previous question, where does my curiosity about the nature of limits come from? It's from a specific experience. I think at root, it's from a specific experience I had when I was a runner in college. Because, like you said, it's not linear. And not only do you have breakthroughs, sometimes you have long plateaus. And as a college runner, I was a miler, and my entire goal in life was to break 4 minutes for the 1,500 meters, which is the sort of metric equivalent of the mile. It's about 17 seconds shorter than a mile, so it's not as big a deal as the 4 minute mile, but it's a big barrier for runners. And I had hit one of those plateaus starting. I ran 4:02 in high school, and then for 4 straight years I ran either 4:01 or 4:02. So by the time I was a junior in college, I had a real sense that I was bumping up against my actual physical limits, that I was training hard, and no matter what I did, I kept running 4:01, 4:02. So I figured that's about what my body was capable of, but I really thought I could do 3:59, and I wanted to break that barrier. And what ended up happening to me in this totally meaningless race when I was a junior in college, early season race with no competition, the gun went off, and I took off as hard as I could, hoping to run that 3:59. And when I went through the first lap, there's a time, the timekeeper calls out splits every lap. So the 200-meter track, and after 200 meters, the timekeeper called out 27 seconds, which is way, way, way too fast for a 4-minute 1,500. So I had this sort of feeling of panic that I'd gone out way too fast and I was going to screw up this race. And I tried to relax a little bit, pull back a bit. And I came through the second lap, and the timekeeper called out 57 seconds, which is a little more reasonable, but still way, way, way too fast. But by this point, I was having this sort of cognitive dissonance between the timekeeper telling me I was running this ridiculously fast pace, and my internal feedback telling me that I was actually feeling pretty good, pretty relaxed. This was okay. This was under control. And the same thing happened third lap. I came through in 1:27. And, at that point, it's just like there's this enormous cognitive dissonance. And I was thinking, okay, I don't know, for whatever reason, I feel great and I'm running really, really fast. This is a special day. Don't waste it. Just put your head down and run. Go for it. And I ended up running 3:52 that day, which was a 9-second personal best after 4 years of running like the same time over and over and over again.
Wow.
And the postscript is that after the race, I was, celebrating with my teammates, and one of them had taken my splits for me so that I could record them in my training log. And I was saying to him, hey, Tom, that was crazy how fast I went out, eh? And he was like, oh, it wasn't that fast. It was, 30 or 31 seconds. I thought it was 27. And so I don't know exactly what happened, but basically the timekeeper was giving me the wrong splits. He probably missed the start by a few seconds and was just reading off the wrong times. But he basically tricked me into thinking that I was having this absolutely amazing day. And in doing so, he basically helped me to have the best day of my life as a runner. And the postscript is that after that, I never had any trouble breaking 4 minutes as a runner. After that, in fact, in my next few races, I got faster again. I ran 3:49 and then 3:44 after that race. And so, the obvious question is, well, you must have changed something in your training. What were you doing differently? Were you eating your Wheaties finally, or, getting more sleep? I've looked back at my training logs many times, and I can't see any evidence that something was different that year compared to the previous year. Probably something came together physically, but there's also clearly a mental part. And I think that believing that I was having a great day because the timekeeper was giving me the wrong splits somehow changed my approach, changed my mindset, allowed me to kind of get past whatever was holding me back. And so at least part of my progress was mental. And so that, needless to say, after that, I kept thinking, man, if I could just recreate that feeling, I could win the Olympics. But it's harder. It's hard to bottle that. And so I spent a long time as a runner after that, trying to understand exactly what had happened, trying to recreate the circumstances. And then as a journalist, I ended up about more than that now, like 12 or 13 years ago, I started writing about the science of running, of endurance, of performance. And inevitably, I kept thinking about that race and trying to track down what it was or what allowed me to do that. And I ended up finding out there were a lot of scientists who were studying the mysteries of performance. I was like, oh, I wish I'd talked to you like 10 years ago when I was competing. But that's the sort of the road that led me down to discover the research that ended up in the book.
And did you ever try to trick yourself again? Like, it's kind of like, placebos, pills work because you don't know they're a placebo. So did you ever say, like, teammates, please surprise me by telling me that I'm actually running faster, or like recreate that exact?
Yeah, it's tricky. So there's certainly a role. The deception is not uncommon in running, especially during workouts. Coaches will do things like say, hey, I'd like you to run 5 times a mile as fast as you can. And then when you're done the 5th one, they'll say, okay, do one more. And you'll say, what do you mean? I went as fast as I could. I'm all done. My tank is empty. And they'll say, well, that's tough. Go do another one and see what you can do. And you discover that maybe you can't do it at exactly the same pace, but you can do it at very close to the same pace. And you're like, oh, like you suddenly realize that there's more, you have more in you than you realized. And that's actually quite a sort of common and famous type of workout. And scientists have studied this kind of thing too. There's lots of deception studies where they, you make a clock run slow, or you change the reading on the thermometer, and you discover that people don't when people slow down in the heat. That's everyone does that. But if you fake the thermometer so that the reading is a little lower than reality, people don't slow down as much. So part of the reason people slow down in the heat is their expectation that they're going to slow down. So anyway, that's not really answering your question. How did I really do it? I never got people to sort of feed me the wrong information, because it's very hard to trick yourself when you know you're being tricked. Now, I will say, placebo studies are fascinating, and there have been a few studies, they're controversial, suggesting that open label placebos work. So there's this study at Harvard for irritable bowel syndrome where they basically gave people pills, and they said, here's some pills, they're a placebo, that, there's nothing but sugar in these pills, but they should help you with your irritable bowel syndrome anyway. And people took them and they're like, hey, I feel better. And so there was like the placebo effect was helping, even though they knew on some level it was a placebo, and the phrasing of what you tell people about what to expect starts to make a difference. And even, we arranged to speak today at 10 o'clock, and I was out running a little late because I did a run that I was slower than I expected. And I kept looking at my watch. Am I going to be on time? Well, I was on time, and that's because I always set my watch like 2 or 3 minutes fast. And I know that my watch is fast, but it's still enough to give me a little bit of a, maybe in a sense, this is harking back to that race. It's enough to give me a little bit of a jolt to say, I'm going to be late. And then a split seconds later, I realize, oh no, I still have an extra, 2 more minutes than I realized. But that's still enough to sort of get me, to give me a jolt and help and get me moving if I'm not moving fast enough. So I think there are ways that can trick yourself. But the conclusion I came to in the book, and I talked to a guy named Amby Burfoot, who's a former Boston Marathon champion and one of my sort of mentors in journalism, and talked to him about these deception workouts where you trick people. And his point was, the fundamental thing isn't tricking yourself. Deception is not the magic, it's belief. The reason deception is is important is because it alters your beliefs. The reason I felt great halfway through that 1500-meter race is because I believed I would. It's not because something magic about the numbers themselves. It's because it changed my belief about how I was going to perform. I believed that I could sustain this very fast pace to the finish. And so there may be, well, not there may be, I think there are more direct ways and more reliable ways of changing your beliefs about what you're capable of that don't rely on trickery, that don't rely on your buddy to say, "Ha ha, fooled you. You're actually going this fast or doing this," because that's a it's a hard thing to replicate. If your coach tricks you, every Friday, then at workout, soon you're going to be like, I'm not going to try hard in this workout because I know when I'm finished, you're going to make me do more. So it's not sustainable. Mm-hmm. So you want to look for other ways of changing your beliefs that you can replicate over and over and over again.
And this can be extrapolated, can be applied to pretty much everything in life. If you believe that you'll be able to do something, then you're willing to go and do it. If you believe that it's not for you, or you don't have the abilities, or that's for other types of people, then you probably won't even start, or there'll be some dissonance in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I wrote a book about endurance, and when you try and define endurance, it's, there's lots of ways you can define it very narrowly or very broadly. And, you can define it as, your VO2 max, or whatever these physiological state measures of aerobic endurance, or you can define it sort of metaphorically, how much are you willing to endure? And they seem like two very different things. But after sort of thinking this through about the role of belief and being willing to endure things, what I concluded is that actually there's a lot more similarities. That it's a lot this concept of being so the way I ended up defining endurance is, which based on some studies in literature, was the struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop. And of course that applies when you're running a marathon. But what I realized is that it's not just a metaphor to say that also applies if you're studying for an exam, or working on a challenging project at work, or whatever the case may be. The mental challenge of continuing to push yourself even when you don't want to, or when when it's getting difficult, is really, I think, not just similar but the same challenge. And so I totally agree that it does. These sorts of discussions have much broader applicability.
It's interesting to think that that's such a trainable or learnable skill. I have a toddler who gives up pretty quickly when something doesn't fit together right, a toy, and that's totally reasonable, just to throw a tantrum and say I can't do it. And there's people who have gone through challenges, whether it's endurance training, or they've gone on a long adventure, or even other parents who just are used to dealing with constant managing of lots of things. The time that they're willing to keep doing something hard, and when something's not working, they're not giving up, or they're not getting anxious as quickly. It's extending their grit in a sense, and it feels a lot like the same type of endurance when you're just trying to do a marathon or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I didn't know when I started working on the book was how much of this is just innate. How much, okay, if you're running a marathon, obviously it depends on, again, the physical parameters, like your heart and your capillaries and your lungs and stuff. But it also depends on how much you're willing to suffer. So then what I didn't know is, is this something you get better at, or is just some people are gifted at squeezing the orange till it's completely dry, and other people just don't want to do that. And I found it interesting. I've always kind of had the suspicion that, just thinking of my own experience and other people that I've trained with, is that you do get better at kind of holding your finger in the metaphorical candle flame. And there is some good data that suggests that's true. Actually, there's a whole bunch of studies that look at pain tolerance in athletes and test them at different times. And even experienced athletes, what they find is that their pain tolerance varies depending on what stage of the training cycle they're at. That when they're approaching a big race, you do a completely unrelated test of pain, like squeezing a blood pressure cuff around their arm, and they're able to tolerate more pain. And then they take a couple of weeks off after their big race or take a month off. You do test their pain tolerance at that point, and it's lower. So the point here is first of all that, yeah, it changes depending on how you're training. And it's not just a one-time thing where if you do some hard training, you learn to tolerate pain. It's something you have to keep constantly working at, or not constantly, but you have to continually prepare yourself to be able to handle pain. And or not just pain, to be able to handle discomfort and challenge. So it's not, what that tells us is that it's not that if you do a lot of training, your nerves get dulled and you don't feel pain anymore. And so you're able to tolerate more pain. This tells us that it's psychological, that it's, or at least this suggests that it's psychological, that with experience of dealing with challenges, you get better at distracting yourself from discomfort, at staying focused on goals, at reframing negative feedback, reframing like, okay, it doesn't fit, and I'm feeling uncomfortable. Does this mean I'm going to fail, or does this just mean I'm successfully doing something difficult or whatever? You can think about discomfort or pain as a negative signal, or just as a confirmation that you're doing something hard. And so I think there's a lot of evidence that in the athletic realm that as you train, you're not just training your body, you're training your mind to keep pushing, and that those sorts of things are transferable. That it's, if you learn to persist and deal with discomfort in one domain like sports, that will transfer to other domains like work or hopefully parenting. I have a couple toddlers too, and I thought I had grit and willingness to deal with challenges, but you realize, man, those stores can get exhausted pretty quickly, and so and it challenges you to be better and to be able to be more patient.
I'm reminded of this anecdote I heard, that in Japanese culture, because of the importance of academics, they work on math problems twice as long as American children are willing to work on math problems, and that sort of alone could account for the discrepancy between the Japanese having consistently high math scores and Americans just sort of being middle of the pack, internationally speaking. And I thought that's really interesting because it sort of reminds me of this endurance, but also has implications for, really, success can just come down to how long you're willing to stick with a thing that's hard. And so well, let's see, where am I going with that? I guess let's talk about, because you were training your ability to stick with like the shapes and the arrows, dulling your willpower essentially before you would go training to see if that would help your running.
So this is so if you start with the observation that one ingredient to athletic success is the ability to stick with things, to deal with mental discomfort, then the question that then comes up is, well, can I train that? I mean, I'm training my legs, I'm training my heart. Can I also train my mind to be more willing to? Because if you think about, say, running a marathon, the sort of overriding challenge during the marathon is you're running at a pace that's really uncomfortable, and every part of your natural instinct is encouraging you to just slow down a little bit. And if you're not, you'll do it without even thinking about it. You won't even realize you've slowed down by 2%. And so it takes tremendous mental focus and concentration to keep pushing yourself into that uncomfortable zone over and over and repeatedly for the entire 2 to 3, 4 hours or whatever it is. And so a guy named Samuel Marcora, who's a researcher in the UK, sort of asked this question: can we train that? And designed some brain training programs using computer tasks where they're not difficult computer tasks, but they require focus. So like you said, you're sitting in front of a computer and shapes or letters or arrows are flashing on the screen, and you have to press one button depending on if you see one sequence of shapes, and a different button if you see another sequence, or whatever the case may be. Again, like an 8-year-old could do these tests, but to do them for 90 minutes responding as quickly as possible. So you're staring at the screen. It's exceptionally unpleasant. And so what Markar has found in a couple of pilot studies is that, yeah, this actually, if you have one group of people just train for a marathon or train for some sort of endurance test, he does the studies with cycling. And if you have another group of people do this exact same physical training, but in addition, they sit in front of a computer and play these sort of horrible computer games. The people who play the horrible computer games have a much greater improvement in their endurance performance when they're tested in a time trial. And that's pretty intriguing. And so I tried that for a feature for Runner's World several years ago. I tried to incorporate brain training in my in my marathon preparation. And it wasn't a study. There's no way of knowing whether I would have been faster or slower without this training, but just doing it was a sort of reminder that this sort of brain training, I mean, it only works if it's really unpleasant and boring. And so at one point early on, I was cycling through 3 different brain training sort of programs, and I told Markar, well, I'm starting, just with, let's say, 5 minutes of each, switching it up each time to keep it interesting. And his reply was like, no, you don't switch them up. You do only 1 game per day to make it maximally to make sure that it's boring. That's part of what the point is. You have to push through the board. And then I was like, oh man. So I got to the end of that, and my conclusion was I'll never do that again. And it's time consuming and it's boring. So to me, it's not like, and they've sort of kept refining the protocols, and it is definitely being used by professional athletes now, versions of this. But for me as a non-professional athlete, my conclusion was, I wouldn't do that again. But as a proof of principle, to me, it's absolutely fascinating that, yeah, you can train your brain to sort of resist mental fatigue, and that will improve your physical performance. And there's, I think that's, again, something that's very generalizable, that, and going back to what you said about, math testing and being willing to stick with a hard problem, I think just as in running, like no matter how strong your brain is, you also have to have a strong body to win. With math, there's also, there's specific abilities that go beyond just willingness to sit in the seat and keep trying. But that's one ingredient that is, whatever your capacity or your potential or your goals are, if you're willing to stick with the problem and even after it's not fun anymore and it's kind of boring, then that's going to be a huge advantage in your ability to complete that problem.
I think it's culturally, we're almost training ourselves the opposite way. We are, with smartphones, basically whenever boredom comes up, we find something to do. So we're actually, instead of embracing the boredom, we're sort of training ourselves to not stick with things.
I worry about that a lot for myself, and then also as a parent, because I remember the first time we flew on an airplane with my kids, and it was just an absolute nightmare. We hadn't really discovered iPads yet. It hadn't occurred to us you could give a little toddler an iPad. And then we looked around and we saw these other kids just kind of, catatonic with their iPads, and we thought, that looks great. And now it's like, if we go on a plane, we're like, okay, did you load up all the little cartoons on Netflix on the iPad? And it's made traveling a billion times easier. But then I'm like, surely they need to learn to stare out the window and be alone with their thoughts. And so it's kind of like a trade-off. I'm the adult, so I have control over their lives. Am I doing this for their happiness or for my convenience? And if I'm doing it for my convenience, what am I costing them? And lots of people, everyone's worried about this now, and I don't want to overly panic that making them happy is going to make them, or keeping them happy is going to destroy their lives or whatever. But yeah, I do think I've always felt that, I challenge anyone to bore me. Like you could put me, especially, I love being on a train and staring out the window. And now it's like trains and planes, you can get internet and stuff, but planes are like the last oasis where you're like, well, I can't get online anyway, so I can't really do any productive work. I might as well just kind of reflect, think, be alone with my thoughts. It's definitely a challenge.
We were talking about the wilderness, the canoeing up in the Quetico before the interview, and that's one of those places that's not only there's no internet, but there's also no noise. There's no like reminder of anything, and it's so almost oppressively. It's like a very heavy silence. It sort of is just like what you might experience in a sensory deprivation chamber. It's like you and your thoughts, and you're like, oh my gosh, now I have to like see what's actually going on in my mind.
And it's amazing. Yeah, I mean, as we were chatting about, I just got back from a 5-day trip a few days ago, I guess last week, and it's always amazing to me how calm I come back from those trips, and how part of it is just life is so stripped down and simple. Your goals for a given day, you wake up and it's like, well, I have to prepare my meals and eat them so that I don't starve. And I have to get from point A to point B, where point B is the next place where I'm planning to camp. And I have to not drown and, be able to carry my canoe or whatever. Other than that, there's no goals. There's not 1,000 different things pulling at your attention. I mean, every time I do that, it's a reminder to me that I wish I spent more time doing that. And it's a contrast to the way sort of daily life is, where there's, my to-do list any given day has 100 things, of which I accomplish 6 or whatever. There's something nice about just being able to focus on some very simple tasks. And, not to sort of ramble on too much, but it reminds me of there was a time in my life when running was the most important thing in my life. I wouldn't say I ran professionally, because that implies I made money and supported myself, but running was my main goal. And for some periods of time, it was the only thing I was doing. I was doing it full time. And there's a lot of things about that, that might make someone want to do that. But one thing is that it's very simple and defined. And so that, I wouldn't want to spend 50 years doing that, but for a few years, it was very neat to just be like, my only goal today is to train so that I can run faster. The outcome is very clearly defined, and it's hard, but you know what you're doing. Whereas, I'm a freelance journalist now. If you ask me, what are my goals in life? It's like, well, there's like 7 different things that I kind of hope I achieve. I'm not sure which one is most important. It's constantly shifting, and it's not clear what I need to do to get to those goals, what the best route is. There's 50 different roads that lead to each of those goals. Whereas running was just like, get up in the morning, eat, train hard, eat, train more, sleep, eat, and then go to bed. And it's like, there's something nice about simplicity that allows you to really sort of focus your energies towards a goal.
I had the experience when I was racing bikes full time I would go to do these week-long stage races, and because normally I would be sort of working part-time or full-time and trying to train, that a 800-mile stage race would feel like a vacation, because all I had to do was race my bike, and I was like, this is so luxurious.
Yeah, it's similar with the outdoor trips. Like, I go on pretty challenging outdoor trips. Like, I like to push myself, but it's like, so this last canoe trip I did, on the final day, we to get out of the wilderness, we had to do a 5.3K portage. So it's like a 3.5 mile portage. That's hard, but it was like, enjoy this, because right now, carrying this canoe over this rocky trail with aching shoulders and bugs biting me, this is so much simpler and easier and more straightforward than as soon as I get home, I'm gonna flick on my computer and there's gonna be 500 messages waiting for me, and I'm gonna have to sort of reply them. So yeah, there's it's funny what you end up defining as challenging versus easy or luxurious.
And so in this context, you've just written this amazing book that's done really well from what I can tell, and you put a lot of years into writing it. It's like, when an Olympian retires and they have to figure out what their life is going to look like. I'm just curious about your process of what your next move is, and how you're thinking about all this.
Yeah, I'm hoping to have that all sorted out by the end of 2018, which unfortunately is past. Like I said, I spent a long time on the book, and I knew I knew it would take me some time to sort of decompress after it finally saw the light of day. And I figured giving myself to the end of 2018 was the book came out in February 2018, so that giving myself like 10 months to.
And for the listener, we're recording this in 2019.
Yes. So this was, yeah, I was giving myself 11 months, and now we're 8 months past that deadline. And I still don't know what comes next. And I sort of mentioned this before, that if you ask me what my goals in life are, well, there's different ones, and I'm not sure how to balance them. I really enjoyed the process of writing a book. I've really enjoyed talking about the book since it's come out and the reception it's gotten, and having a lot of interesting conversations with people on these topics and learning more. So in some sense, you talk to a lot of people. I've written this book about endurance. I've talked to so many people and learned so much more about endurance since the book came out. So it's tempting to say, well, okay, I should put that in a book and call it Endure 2 or whatever. But I'm at this point, at least, I'll certainly never say never, but that doesn't sound to me like the right challenge for me, of just kind of like, let's pick up all the table scraps that I left, floating around my computer and mold them together into something else. So I'm trying to, what I really would like to do in a perfect world is to find something that, a topic that engages me as much as endurance did in order to write Endure. The problem is that Endure was really like a life. I started running when I was 15,
Mm-hmm.
and I published it when I was 42 or something like that. Nobody has 10 topics like that. I can't spend another 25 years being passionate about something and then write a book. Or at least it is financially not practical for me to spend 25 years on the next book. So I'm trying to find something that I'm passionate about, but recognizing that nothing may be quite as much of a passion project for me as Endure was, since it was something that I'd spent so much of my life on. So I guess the one good thing is I'm a freelance journalist, so I have a pretty good license to explore different topics. So what I'm trying to start doing is taking some assignments that give me a chance to spend a month or two digging into a topic, write a magazine piece about it, and then hope that after a while, one of them will be like, "Oh man, there's a lot more here than I realized. This is something I want to dig deeper into." But that's a slow process, and I'm, because I write regularly for Outside Magazine. I write 6 pieces a month about basically the science of endurance, is the science of endurance and adventure. But so I'm still really immersed in that world. So
Yes.
So there is a temptation to just kind of find another topic within that world, because that's what I'm most comfortable and competent in, and that's what people who've read my journalism or my book for that matter expect from me. So yeah, there's a lot of things to juggle in terms of what would make me happy versus what would be sustainable and consistent with my current trajectory. And so the short answer is we're talking here in August 2019, and I have no idea. I don't know what my next big project is going to be, although I'm still sort of puttering along writing as a columnist for Outside.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've got your your feelers out for like what is gonna be really compelling or curiosity driven, or give you that feeling of obsession. And I'm wondering if you have like a list of things, or if something does come across and you're like, ooh, that is interesting. Do you do anything with that? Have you found like a handful of those things that are piquing your interest?
The truth is, I've ended up spending a lot more time. So let me use this opportunity to give a shout out and a plug to a new book by David Epstein called Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialist World. So David Epstein is the guy who wrote The Sports Gene about 6 years ago, which to my mind was the best sports science book I'd ever read, and sort of, I would say, the model on which I tried to base Endure in terms of mixing science and storytelling, and sticking to keep leaving the science complex and not trying to oversimplify it into some message. Anyway, David has a new book out this year called Range, and it's all about the benefits of not sort of thinking you have to launch yourself into 10,000 hours of specialization when you're 3 years old if you want to be any good in anything, and that people tend to. In fact, you could almost read it as we mentioned grit earlier, as an argument for that more grit isn't always better. That sticking with something, if you try something and it's not working out, sure, sometimes it's good to stick with it, but other times it's good to say, you know what, I actually don't like this. I'm not enjoying this. Maybe I should cut loose and cut it loose and try something else. Now, if you do that every 6 months for your whole life, you're not going to get very far. But the idea is you give yourself time to find the right match, so that then when you have the right match, you can really go all out, and you have a breadth of experience from the other things you've tried that will give a richer, give you a different skill set than if you had just been doing one thing your whole life. So anyway, I'm kind of taking that to heart and saying I'm going to give myself time, and part of that, I think, is not necessarily being too goal oriented in that time. Part of it is getting out for the canoe trip and letting your mind wander and seeing connections and following threads of anything that's interesting. So, as you said, if I stumble on something that looks interesting to me, at the very least, I'll say, yeah, that guy, that's an interesting article. That guy has a book. I should get that book and read that and find out more about it. Or I should see if I can write. I wonder if there's something I could write in this topic. Even if so, what I try and avoid doing, at least what I'm trying to avoid right now, and maybe I'll have to get more goal oriented at some point. I try not to, every time I see something interesting, to say, could I imagine spending 4 years writing a book about this? Because there aren't many things that clear that threshold right now. So right now I'm just trying to say, could I imagine spending a week reading a book about this? And if the answer is yes, then hell, I'll do it. But yeah, at a certain point I'll have to start being more focused. But yeah, like my list right now is very short. I haven't found the things that I want to write a book about. And I'm thinking in some sense on a bigger, sort of more strategic level, and saying, do I want to write more about the science of endurance, or the science of sport, or the science of performance? Do I want to write about something completely different? Do I want to write about hard science? Or do I want to, because I do have I've sort of stumbled accidentally into this science of endurance niche, and it's a good fit for me, but I don't know if it's necessarily where I want to spend my whole life. But as you think about career paths, if I write another book about endurance, it's going to be very hard for me. I mean, it's already probably going to be very hard for me to shake off the sort of label of, he's that guy who writes about the science of endurance, right?
Right.
And so there's advantages to that, because then if there's a science of endurance story, people are like, oh, let's see what Hutchinson says about that. Or at least in my imagination, that's what people say. But the disadvantage is, it's like, why is this guy trying to write about horticulture? He's the science of endurance guy. So anyway, I don't mean to use you for psychoanalysis.
Really and if you write a book, you're not only thinking about it while you write about it, but then you're talking about it for years afterwards. And so
if you're lucky.
Yeah. So it's a long time span to like talk about the same thing. And I'm curious, you have a PhD in physics, like where does that all fit in?
Yeah, it's kind of off the puzzle set now. It's not fitting into the jigsaw puzzle. I started. I went straight. I studied physics as an undergraduate, and that was sort of, maybe not by chance, but it wasn't like I didn't know what I wanted to study in university. I applied to 3 different universities in history, engineering, and physics. I ended up going to the one where I applied in physics, partly because my girlfriend at the time was going there. So I ended up in physics. And the advice I got was study something hard, and it's easier and you can always apply those skills you learn to other realms, to other endeavors. Whereas, put it this way, if you study physics, you can move to other areas. If you study most other areas, you can't move to physics. Like it's a kind of one-way thing. So it was good advice. It was interesting studying physics as an undergrad and really sort of getting deep into some math and finding out about that. When I finished undergrad, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I basically followed the same advice, and I had an opportunity to go do a PhD. So I did that, and I did it in England, which meant it's a shorter PhD than it is in North America. So that it's not quite as much of a investment of time as it sounds like. And I actually did a couple of years of postdoc after that, and eventually, I mean, it's always hard in retrospect to know what factors lead you to change careers or whatever. But one thing I remember is just the level of passion and interest that some of my colleagues in physics had when I was a postdoc, that we would spend 14 hours in the lab and then go home for the night, come back the next morning, and one of my colleagues would be like, "Hey, did you read that article about such and such an experiment in Physics Today?" And I'd be like, "No, of course not. I was here for 14 hours yesterday. I didn't go home and read about physics." And they'd be like, "Oh, okay, well, I did." And I realized that they had that passion about physics, and so that was kind of one of the things that encouraged me to jump to I went and studied journalism, because I thought I wanted to have a chance of ending up in a career that I was that interested in, and this is what's ended up happening. And now I find myself saying, well, okay, but maybe I want to find something else, and so maybe my bar for finding something I'm passionate about is a little too high. But anyway, to answer your question about where the physics fits in, I don't use my physics training in any real capacity these days. I don't have to know any physics to write the stuff that I write, but I think that scientific training has been really helpful to me in terms of demystifying science and being willing and comfortable talking to scientists and asking them questions, asking them dumb questions without worrying about whether it makes me look stupid or anything like that, and just not shying away from complexity. To when if I'm writing about the biomechanics of running or something, and there's equations or things, then going back to this, what we talked about confidence and belief, even if I don't know the biomechanics, I'm confident that if someone explains it to me clearly enough, I'll be able to understand what they're saying and hopefully translate that. And so that has helped. But I haven't written about physics, and I'll admit I think about it sometimes. I think, well, maybe now it's time, 15 years or whatever after I left physics, maybe I can have some interesting insights into some of the physics research that's ongoing these days. I think I struggled when I first started in journalism. I didn't want to write about physics because I did a little bit of it, but what I found was that I was a little insecure in talking to physicists. That I'd listened to my interview tapes, and I'd realized that I was sort of inserting myself and saying, well, when I was getting my Ph.D. in physics, trying to be accepted as one of them and show that I was belonging instead of just being a journalist. So there was a little bit of ego there, and also it's harder to have an ear for as an outsider to sports science. It's easier for me to see what's not easily understood by people who haven't trained in sports science, because I haven't trained in sports science. In physics, it's a little bit harder to have that instinct for what needs more explanation and what doesn't, what's obvious and what isn't, because I'd spent so much time in physics. You kind of lose a little bit of that flavor. So anyway, that's the physics side.
Thanks for sharing. You and I have some interesting parallels. I'm a PhD dropout in virology.
Wow.
Now I'm interviewing people, so switch to journal, and I write books, and so it's kind of cool to see the similarities. And I think a good lesson for people listening is, right, we were talking about how easily you can pivot or give up something and switch, and this is like if you get a PhD or if you're in a PhD program, it's like you've picked a life trajectory, and it's kind of hard to make that switch because you have the sunk costs of all your education. And I think it's important to mention for anyone listening, like it's you can always switch, even if you've done a decade's worth of training in an area, or if you've gone deep writing a book about a certain thing. Like you can continue to reinvent yourself, even though it's probably like the longer you spend, the more scary it gets.
It's funny as you say that. I sort of get this flash of like, you're right. I've done it before. Why am I so worried about the prospect of not staying in the endurance niche, that I've done it before and I can do it again? But because it is true. Yeah. I spent a long time training in physics, and with no disrespect to physics, because it's great, I couldn't be happier that I had I made the switch that I did, because I've really, really enjoyed the last 15 years in a way that I never would have thought possible since switching. And in terms of being willing to abandon those sunk costs, one conversation I remember, so when I was a postdoc and I was contemplating this switch, I ended up going to my boss, who's a guy I respected a lot, a really good physics researcher, and sort of asking him, in this sort of needy way, it's like, Keith, do you think I could make it? Like, can I get a tenure track position in physics and become a professor? And, I'm not talking about winning the Nobel Prize, but just be a guy who's doing some research, contributing to the store of knowledge. And he was like, no doubt, Alex, I have no doubt that you can do that. And so I took that and I was like, okay, good. Then I'm going to leave. I'm going to quit. Because there's, we all struggle with this. No one wants to be a failure. No one going back to what we were saying earlier, I view one of my great strengths is that I am willing to work hard and to stick with things for a long time, to train hard as a runner. I kept training. I had injury problems. I had mononucleosis in high school. I had 2 years of injury problems, of knee problems. And I'm the guy who keeps going and keeps going and keeps pushing. But the best decision I made was at that point was to not keep going, not just keep following the path just because I'd started or just to prove that I could, but to find something that was a better match for me. And so that was very validating for me to read in David Epstein's book Range about the fact that actually that's very common, that people who are willing to make the switch, if they end up with a better match, then they achieve more overall or reach a higher level because they've correctly matched their interests to their pursuit rather than just sticking with the first thing they started with.
It sounds like I'm going to have to read that book and then
definitely,
then have him on the show.
Oh, absolutely.
So because of this science background that we have, it leads me, again, going back to identity, I think, I can design little self-experiments. I can test things out, sample size of just me, but and your book led me to do that. So before I had even sort of gotten that far, just the idea of the central governor, the mind being able to influence endurance, I thought, I'm going to get hypnotized.
Wow.
So I'm not sure if you covered hypnosis in the book, but I had sort of heard of other athletes getting hypnotized. So I called a hypnotist friend and we did a session, and we're actually he's going to come on the show and we're going to sort of talk about the outcomes and what he was doing. But basically I said, first I want to get rid of fear, because in bike racing, your ability to corner at 30 miles an hour in a pack can be scary.
It's very rationally limited by fear.
But then I also wanted to like try to boost my endurance, and I was hypnotized, and the next day I won 2 races, and I was like, oh wow, didn't necessarily see that coming. I don't know if it was the hypnosis or I was just like normally getting better, but it was cool to like go out and take an idea from the book. Okay, the mind can help me be better, and then come up with an experiment. Let's see if hypnosis works, and then winning races. It's like, wow, that was a fun little test.
So here's the next test. Next time you get hypnotized, and you do it for a couple races, and for one race you have your friend hypnotize you into thinking you're terrible, and for the other race you have your friend hypnotize you into thinking you're great, but don't tell you which one's which. And then see whether you do well in the good race and terrible in the race where you're supposed to be terrible.
That would be really interesting. Unfortunately, I think I've permanently changed my subconscious view of myself to have more endurance. But I'm curious, like besides the boring shape exercise when you were training, like what other experiments have you done as you encountered all these?
Yeah, it's been interesting. So I'm unlike you. I'm actually not a strong self-experimenter. I have this huge skepticism about my own ability to distinguish between a real effect and my expectation of that effect. So, for instance, because I write about sports science, I get daily invitations to try products, and I don't do product reviews. That said, there are a few things that I haven't been able to resist trying out. So on the simple side, one of the bits of research that I found really intriguing was the link between facial expression and perception of effort. And Eliud Kipchoge, the world record holder for the marathon, he's sort of famous now for, in the last half of his race, he'll periodically just smile, which I initially thought he was just like grimacing in pain, but he said no, it's a deliberate smile, because to him that sort of makes the connection between how his legs feel and how he's feeling in his mind. And there is some decent, or well, let's call it some preliminary research in the area that suggests that your facial expression does influence how the rest of your body's feeling, and in your perception of, you're getting all these signals from your body from your heart rate, your breathing rate, your legs, and your brain decides how to interpret that, whether to interpret it as like you're cooked or you can keep going. And if you're smiling, then there's this link between, a sense of ease and your facial expression that you can, there seems to be some evidence that you can alter your perception of effort by smiling. So what I've found is that I have a lot of trouble smiling during a run. It just feels absolutely goofy. But becoming aware, it's allowed me to become aware of how often, like how almost always whenever I'm running in any sort of hard effort, my face becomes this grimace of agony. And it's like, showing the world just how hard I'm pushing. And if I become aware of that, even if I don't smile, if I just say, okay, Alex, just relax your face, just let it be as relaxed as possible, which is a cue that coaches have used for decades and decades, just telling athletes, just let your relaxed face, feel your cheeks bounce. And I can do that. And the first thing that's funny for me is it's like, oh, I'm going as hard as I can. I can relax my face. It doesn't make my legs go slower. So why was I making this big effort face? It's like, it's weird to me. It's not clear to me why I grimace like that. But as soon as I relax my face, it definitely feels easier. Now that can be a double-edged sword, because sometimes if I'm out by myself doing a hard workout and I feel my face in the grimace, and I'm like, okay, relax the face. I relax the face and I'm like, this feels easier. This feels so much easier. This is great. And then I check my next split and it's like, oh, it's because I slowed down. So to me, that tactic, what I've found is it's most useful if I'm in a workout or a race and I'm trying to keep up with somebody. So the pace is being dictated by someone else.
Yeah.
And my ability to stay with them is dictated by how hard it feels to me. So I can stick with them, but make sure I'm relaxing my face. And to me, that's actually been a really powerful, but absolutely simple thing to try. And the other thing I've tried on the opposite end of the spectrum, from like totally simple, non-invasive, then there's electric brain stimulation, which is a technique called transcranial direct current stimulation, which is very, very simple. It's basically a 9-volt battery and 2 electrodes. If you put the electrodes in the right place, you can alter temporarily how your brain is perceiving effort, or you can alter other things. I've tried that now a couple of times. One time with, so there's a company called Halo Neuroscience that sells headphones that deliver electric brain stimulation. I had a lot of trouble with that. This was a fairly early prototype. I'm bald, and I live in Canada, harsh winters. Maybe my scalp is very tough, but I had a lot of trouble making electric contact, so it wasn't very comfortable for me. So I tried it for about a month, and every time I managed to actually get electrical contact with my scalp, I had to like push down on these spikes so hard that by the time I finished my 20 minutes of stimulation, I'd just be in a terrible mood and have a terrible run. I tried it again earlier this summer, and I've written a story that hasn't yet been published for Outside about it. So there'll be more details about that. I tried it using a protocol that professional cyclists or one professional cycling team is using in Europe. And again, for me, it's really hard to tell whether it's doing anything. I go out and ride. I don't know, would I have been a % faster? Because it's something that's very subtle that you don't sort of feel like at least it doesn't make you feel like $1 million. You might feel like $1 million just because you're supposed to. But that's a sort of classic illustration to me of something that's very hard to evaluate just based on how you feel, other than the fact that it's like that open label placebo for IBS that I was mentioning earlier, that it probably helps in a way, if not just that you're doing something, but you're doing something that is supported by some science. So you have a plausible reason to believe that you're going to be faster. That in itself feels, and I definitely felt that feeling of like, I bet I'm going to be able to climb this mountain pass better than I would otherwise because I had electric brain stimulation. So I'm interested in all that stuff, and I'm interested in trying things on that full spectrum. In terms of where I would like the sport to go and where I think is meaningful for people like me who are non-professional athletes, I think it's like having a greater understanding of your own feelings and confidence. So like the becoming aware of facial expression is to me really interesting. The electric brain stimulation I think is really fascinating for what it tells us about the nature of limits. But I'm not. I have to admit that I'm a bit of a, I don't know if I'm a Luddite or just a sort of purist or a get off my lawn kind of old guy. But I kind of think I'm not sure I want that to be legal in sport. That because once if you let some people do it, then eventually basically everyone has to do it. Otherwise, you're not going to be competitive.
I know that the Halo Science is they partnered with USA Cycling. I saw that in their sports sponsored, and my understanding is that it helps more with like muscle memory and skill development necessarily than endurance. But I'm still, personally, I would try it and then go do high speed sprints or accelerations or things like that may benefit the most from something like that.
Yeah, and so there's different protocols and different ideas about how it helps. It's definitely one protocol is to use it during training, and it's supposed to help you sort of encode the neural changes as a result of training more effectively, so that you're maybe going to get more benefit from training. There are some studies, also some direct studies, suggesting that you take it right before performance, and it can enhance performance, change your perception of effort. It depends where you put the electrodes. There's a lot of controversy about whether it works at all. Like for every study that finds a benefit, there's a study that doesn't find a benefit. So it's unclear how much that depends on specific where the electrodes are or how much it works. But yeah, it's also a technique that's being used for all sorts of other conditions, things like depression or even learning, Parkinson's disease, to be able to walk better. So it's not like I don't want to say that it shouldn't be used at all, because there's a lot of interesting potential for it. It's just, I guess, different sports have different kind of relationships with technology. And so if you think about running as a relatively simple sport, compare that to cycling, and then you compare that to like triathlon, and then compare that to like e-gaming or something like that, there's maybe a hierarchy of like the extent to which equipment and technology are just acknowledged as part of the sport, sort of like Formula One versus NASCAR. And so I come from a running background where in theory, it's never quite this simple. What you like to imagine is that it's just a bunch of people lined up with essentially no equipment other than the shoes on their feet. Although that's become controversial recently too, with some high tech shoes giving performance advantages. Sorry?
The new rocket shoes that they have?
Yeah. Well, there hasn't been quite rocket shoes, but shoes with carbon fiber plates in them that seem to propel people forward, or at least enhance running efficiency. So it's always a fool's game to pretend that technology is not involved in any sport. But as a runner, I think my bias is a little bit more towards, hey, let's keep the technology out of it. Let's just make it a test of human versus human. But I think people in other sports might view it quite differently and say, no, it's, technology's always been a part of the sport.
Yeah. In cycling, they have, the governing body puts these sort of like made up restrictions on how heavy a bike can be or the dimensions, and it sort of constrains the advancing of technology. But if they were to lift those restrictions, then you get this sort of huge spectrum of testing different bicycle shapes and designs and materials, and that would be kind of cool too. But it would be definitely a dollars wins the race, because of how technology can really give a big boost.
That's exactly it. I mean, I agree that it could be fascinating. And again, that the sort of NASCAR or stock car versus Formula One model, it's like both sports have tons of fans, but in stock car racing, you in theory, although maybe not in practice, in theory, it's like everyone's driving the same car, and it's only the driver that's going to determine who's going to win. In Formula One, it's like who's making the engine on this car. And yes, they have limits as to what you can do in a given car, but it's understood to be an engineering competition as well as a driving competition. You have to have a good driver, but a great driver is not going to win if he's also not on a team that has some of the best engineering. And so one of the arguments is that, in Formula One racing, some of the advances they come up with, they end up trickling down to consumer cars 15, 20 years later. And so it's great to have this incentive for technology to be developed. And you can make the same argument in sports. It's like, well, with electric brain stimulations, you can say it's great to have people testing this out because it could help people who are struggling to return from traumatic brain injuries and learning to walk again. If you can enhance their endurance, it's going to be fantastic. And that's true. And you make the same argument for new shoes and things like that. It's like, you make running easier for people. Yeah, it's going to allow a marathon to go 1% faster, but maybe it's going to make it more easier for people to get out and run and get in shape. So it's tricky, and it varies from sport to sport. And yeah, cycling is definitely a case where it's like, I've already spent $10,000 on my bike. Why am I going to get upset if I have to spend another $200 on a brain stimulator, right? Like it's a different scenario compared to running, where a lot of the greatest runners in the world grow up without shoes, and they have no money, no equipment, and that's they reach the top in a way that's almost impossible in most other sports. There's a lot of other sports where you have to have equipment and infrastructure and technology and money, and so it's just there's different norms and different expectations and different things to get excited about in different contexts, I guess.
I wanted to ask about a couple of specific things that actually my dad is an athlete as well, and I told him I was interviewing you, and so he said, ask him about aging and endurance. And of course, we're all aging, but some people,
some faster than others. From what I can tell.
So what have you encountered in terms of, because athletes are competing later and later? There's still pro cyclists in their 40s now, and Olympians are getting older. But what should aging athletes sort of know about endurance?
Yeah, well, this is a huge topic. We could spend hours on this alone. There's a couple things that I'll just, bubbling to the top of my head. One is pro athletes competing later into their 40s. At least some of that is a function not of like better understanding of physiology or anything. It's a function of changed financial incentives and environment. It's 40 years ago, you couldn't make a living, at least not a decent one, as a runner, unless maybe you were like the Olympic champion and you were getting paid under the table. Now, in a lot of sports, it's financially feasible and beneficial to train full time when you're professional, and that makes it more reasonable to keep doing it in your 30s and 40s, as opposed to thinking, oh boy, I've got 2 kids now, I think I'd better get a real job somewhere. So I think part of that is just that people are able to do it for long, are able to make it a career rather than just sort of chasing a dream in their 20s.
Okay.
On a more, I mean, athletes are also more aware of things like nutrition and sleep and recovery. But I think to some extent, progress in that area has been a little bit oversold. I think the reason we're seeing more older athletes is mainly financial opportunity. On a recreational level, I think the big evolution, or the big thing, the question that people have been exploring is I'm 43 now, and I'm slower than I was when I was 23. How much of that is because I'm old, and how much of that is because I don't train the way I did when I was 23? And the balance of that answer, there's a bit of both for sure, but the balance of that answer, I think, has shifted a lot in the last 10, 15 years. Scientists have started to conclude that a lot of what we thought was just aging, biological aging, you're getting old, so this is what happens to you. There's all these studies that have said, how much does VO2 max decline per year or per decade? After your 30s, it declines between 9 and 12% per decade or whatever, and you're going to lose 1% of muscle mass every year after the age of 35 or 40 or whatever. that's an observation that has held true in the past, but it reflects a lot. What it reflects is not necessarily that you're getting older. What it reflects is that I'm following this trajectory exactly. I have two young kids, and my career is sort of at a level where things are busier than they used to be, and I have a house with an unbelievable number of like weeds and maintenance issues and things like that. So all of a sudden, the time available to go to train is much lower. And my friends have the same thing. So even when I'm like, oh, I'd like to go play tennis, well, none of my friends are available to go play tennis. Uh, and so changes in activity level are probably a much bigger factor than we thought than aging itself. And so I personally, I'm working very hard to try and shake that off, to make it a priority to say, no, I'm going to keep. I'm not as concerned about being competitive as I was 20 years ago, but I want to keep training. I'm going to stay active in fun ways that are going to be sustainable, so that if I do get bored of running at some point, I play pickup basketball on Friday nights, and I've started rock climbing with some friends, and I joined a tennis club near me with a friend of mine to play tennis. I want to find avenues to stay active, because I think aging is much less inevitable. And it's again, so I go out and do some strength training and whatever, and I'll pull a muscle I'll tweak something in my back, and it's easy to say, I'm getting older. I just can't. Yeah. I can't exercise the way I used to. And it's like, well, if I take that attitude, then it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because I'm going to exercise less, and so when I do, I'm gonna hurt myself, and it's going to become this cycle that means I do less, and then I'm less capable, and so I do less, and so I'm less capable. And so I'm trying to fight against that, and just basically I'm trying to, stick my hands over in my ears and ignore the signs and just tell myself, I'm not getting older. I'm going to keep doing what I always used to do. I used to get injured as a kid too, a little bit. And yes, there's going to be inevitable changes, but I think those, if you make the time to keep training and not just, so as a runner, it's tempting to say, well, I don't want to get slower. I'm going to keep running the same as I used to. Thing is, when I was 20, I ran, but I also was active in many other ways. I was an active commuter on my bike, and I went on canoe trips, and I played pickup basketball with friends. So if you're 50 and you say, but I'm still running the way I always did, but I'm getting weaker, and I'm getting hurt more. It's like, but have you stopped everything else you used to do? Because if so, then you're missing other parts of what's needed to stay healthy. So anyway, long ramble, but I guess those are the two big points I would make: is pro athletes, it's opportunity. Rec athletes, it's a choice. Not that aging doesn't exist, but it's more of a choice than we maybe thought 20 years ago.
And it's interesting. I'm imagining, so a retired 65-year-old who started playing more sports again may be more fit than a 55-year-old who's still in the midst of a busy career, simply because they're able to actually spend more time playing.
Yeah, if you look at the sort of age group results in big mass participation events like the New York Marathon or whatever, what you find is actually the dead zone is like late 20s to early 40s. The weakest and least participation, that's when people are building careers and starting families. And so you get these studies that say the limits of endurance are different than you once thought. And actually the 40 to 45 category and the 45 to 55 category outperform the 30-year-olds and the 25-year-olds. It's like, that's a function of who's competing. Like the aging is real to some extent. And biologically, a 45-year-old is likely to be less capable than a 25-year-old. But sociologically, a 45-year-old, not all 45, but if you're lucky at 45, you've maybe established your career and your kids can wipe their own bums and stuff. And so you have a little bit more time to get out and train compared to when you're 30 and all this stuff is just getting going.
Or your wife or husband says, you can't even race today because I really need your help. So if they didn't even show up.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's different for different people. I had my kids when I was 38 and 40. So my dead zone is actually a little later than is like I was training hard when I was 32, but it'll be difficult for me to train seriously in my 40s, because I'll have kids who are, when I'm 50 or when I'm 49, I'll still have a 9-year-old at home who I maybe can't always leave alone and stuff. So it depends for different people, but those factors are real, and it's not you can ignore those factors, but you can be aware of them and say, all right, I know what's going on here, and I'm going to make choices that give me an opportunity to stay more active than I might otherwise be, because A, it's fun, B, it's healthy, and C, if I do want to hit the road when I'm 50 and train hard, it's going to be a lot easier if I've maintained some broad-based fitness than if I've just kind of been hanging on for dear life.
Yes. And it's so we're almost talking about, like the link between longevity. It's like even more long-term endurance, like the endurance of an entire lifetime of staying fit. And so there's like the endurance like in a single workout or a single event, but then there's like the endurance of how the healthy lifespan, how long can you endure that?
Yeah. Well, it's I always think that one of the things endurance training teaches you is you're always any action you take, you're judging like, how is this going to affect me now? How is this going to affect me in a week? How's this going to affect me in a month? And to be an endurance athlete, you have to be not too present focused. You have to be future oriented to some degree, because you're putting in all this work that is on some level, at least, unpleasant, in the hopes of a payoff down the road. And you can think of that in terms of training for an event 6 months away. But I think what you're saying, and I agree, is that this also sort of can translate. Yeah, you're thinking across decades, not just across months or weeks. Like, if I stay active now, hopefully, and don't just run, as much as I love running, hopefully I will, still be strong and healthy enough to get myself out of a chair when I'm 80, and walk to the store or whatever. And I think, those are definitely motivating factors for me, that especially because my natural inclination is I just want to go out and do endurance exercise. And I'm like, I need to do things involving the upper body, and I need to do things that will maintain my muscle mass too, because that's, in terms of aging, again, going from the health perspective of aging, it's important to be aerobically healthy, which will reduce your risk of, heart disease and diabetes and things like that. But frailty is a huge issue for older people, and for someone like me who's very thin because of that's how my frame is, but also because I do a lot of running and things like that. If I slip and fall and break an ankle or something like that, and can't move for 4 months or for 4 weeks, so that I lose a bunch of muscle mass, I don't have the muscle mass to spare. And that's a common trajectory of aging for people, is that they're doing fine until something happens. Then they lose a bunch of muscle mass, and then they no longer have the strength to carry out the activities of daily living, to be independent, and they end up getting institutionalized or being put on that trajectory. So anyway, yeah, I'm sort of digressing from the point, but
yeah.
But thinking about these things in a decades long perspective, and being future oriented, not just present oriented, is, I think, a big aspect of endurance.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you would like to share with our audience?
There's nothing that leaps to mind. I mean, the book is called Endure, but you were kind enough to mention that. As you can see, I'm digressing a lot, so I'm thinking about lots of different things. But yeah, there's no important thing that I think we've missed that listeners must check out.
Cool. Well, where can people find you, and what's the best place for them to get in touch with you should you wish to be found?
Yeah, probably the best place to find me is on Twitter. My handle is Sweat Science, all one word. That's where I, as I write new articles, or if I see something that's interesting, that's where I post it. So I'm most active on Twitter. I do have a website, alexhutchinson.net, where you can sort of explore older stories and bio information or something, if such is your desire. That's probably it. I just joined Instagram, but I haven't figured out how it works yet. So I wouldn't recommend searching me out there. But Twitter, Sweat Science is the way to go.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for being not just telling us about your book, but also taking us inside your process and your career and all these different things and being open. Really appreciated the interview, and also this book is just I've been reading it for weeks, and it's so wonderful, and I'll keep referring back to it. So it's really a great book. I've recommended it to my listeners and my email list already. So yeah, thanks for writing it and spending such diligent effort to do that.
Thanks, Derek. It's great to hear that you've enjoyed the book, and I enjoyed this conversation. I apologize to you and to everyone for being so digressive, but hopefully we touched on some topics that will be of interest to people. So I appreciate your patience with that.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay, thanks.
All right, another great episode with Alex Hutchinson. This book, I mentioned in the show that it led me to try hypnosis, which you'll get to hear about in a upcoming interview with. We did a hypnosis session to try to increase performance, but I've done experimentation with breathing and holding my breath to try to release red blood cells to improve the oxygen carrying capacity, looking at different ways to modify belief, visualization, and gosh, there's so much cool stuff that if you read this book, if you're an athlete or not, definitely read the book. But if you are an athlete, there's going to be so many things that you're going to want to go and try and experiment with and see how it impacts you, because he breaks it down so well, and you can go and you can test every variable that he's talking about, whether it's hydration or what you're eating or your pre-workout ritual, all these different things, smiling when you're at the end of a long, hard workout, what that does to you. And, I think it's just so important for us to get curious about maybe what are our limits and how can we change those, and then go out and do experimentation, try some things. So if you made it this far, you're amazing. Thank you for listening to the whole episode. And if you're the kind of person that likes to help other people, if you thought this was fascinating or useful information, then your friends and family probably will too. So please share it with them on your social media. And if you have questions or feedback, you can send them to Alex or myself. My email is derek@derekloudermilktom.com. If you're curious about working together, if you're an entrepreneur or high performer, and you're curious about improving your performance in all of these areas, then it might be possible for us to work together. So you can also email me, derek@derekloudermilk.com, about that. And one last personal request, which is that if we can help more people, become self-experimenters and learn about this information and see where their own limits lie, then we can all rise together. So to that effect, would love for you to leave a rating and review and let other people know about the show, what you find useful. And iTunes is a really good place for that, since that's where a lot of people find out about the show. And then we can get this out to more people. More people can find out about it, and we can all explore together, which is super fun. All right, that is all for today's episode. Now it's your turn to go out there and be adventurous.